I'd like to welcome everyone to the National Watercolor Society this morning. Today we have a live conversation about the early years of the California Watercolor Society and the permanent collection of the National Watercolor Society. Our talk today is the historical background of these two societies, their artists, the paintings, and the times they lived in, as well as the artists and paintings from the NWS permanent collection that is now showing at the NWS Gallery in San Pedro. We have Gordon, our guest speakers today are Gordon McClelland. He's an author, an art historian, and artist. He has also curated art exhibitions in America and Europe since the 1970s. In addition, Gordon has authored or co-authored over 22 books and catalogs that link together California art and California's social history. Most recently, Gordon curated the California Watercolor Society, the first 50 years, that is now on display at the Hilbert Museum in Orange, California. And we also have with us Ken Goldman, an internationally known artist, author, teacher, and art juror, a recipient of numerous awards. Ken's work is included in the permanent collections of the San Diego Museum of Fine Art, the Hilbert Museum of California Art, the North Carolina's Hickory Museum, Zhaowin Museum in Qingdao, China, and others. He is past president of the National Watercolor Society and currently is serving as NWS Historian. And my name is Stephanie Goldman. I'm an artist, teacher, and art juror, and president of the society at the present moment. I have been honored to serve on the board of directors of the National Watercolor Society since 2015, and it's a real pleasure to be here today and welcome our two guest speakers, Gordon and Ken. And Ken, would you like to go ahead and start? Well, before I say welcome, Gordon, welcome, Ken, go ahead and start.
Thanks, Stephanie. I know you. Anyway, first off, if any of you are in Southern California, I really recommend that you go to see both exhibitions. First, you can go to the Hilbert Museum in Orange and see all the artists associated with the first 50 years of the founding of NWS, which was then known as the California Watercolor Society. And after that, go to San Pedro to the actual NWS Gallery to see our own permanent collection of award-winning paintings purchased each year since 1950 until now. As historian of the NWS, I'm often asked questions about early California artists and always do my best to have ready answers. But the beauty of having Gordon here with us today is that he not only wrote nearly all of the definitive books about these artists that I use when I'm researching, he even knew many of them personally and interviewed them face to face. So Gordon is literally my go-to encyclopedia whenever I don't have ready answers. And he'll discuss his 20 favorite paintings from both exhibitions in the next 50 or 60 minutes. So without further ado, take it away, Gordon. And if you don't mind, can you please start by saying something about the California Watercolor Society logo? And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now so the slides come up. Okay. So go ahead, Gordon. There you go.
Terrific. Stephanie, you asked me about the California Watercolor Society name, specifically about why there was two words, water and color, as opposed to one word, watercolor. And the answer to that is that the watercolor prior to the 1930s or 40s, pretty much every watercolor society in America used two words. The American Watercolor Society was two words when it was started. The New York Watercolor Club, which was another very early society, used two words. And the Philadelphia Watercolor Society still uses two words. So it was the common way to spell watercolor prior to that. And they began to around the 30s and the 40s, you start seeing where it become used, referred to as watercolor, all one word. Just as an additional bit of information, the California Watercolor Society actually, for a couple of years, was called the California National Watercolor Society. And then they dropped California altogether, and it became the National Watercolor Society, watercolor, all one word. And it's been the NWS, National Watercolor Society, ever since the early 70s. The other question you asked me about was the logo that's used here. My son, Austin, and I curated this show together, and we were looking for some kind of a logo to put up on the wall in the exhibition space and at the Hilbert Museum. So we located this one, and Austin picked this one out as one of the favorite ones. Here, let me introduce Austin here for a second.
I can't hear.
Oh, Austin can't hear because I have my earphones on. But I don't know if you can put Austin on the screen or not. Oh yeah, there he is on the small one. That's Austin, my son, and he co-curated the show, and he redesigned this logo. He cleaned it all up and made it available in a large format so that we could put it on the wall there. And we thought it was just a really interesting logo. They had 3 or 4 different ones that they used at different times, but this is the one that we thought was the most interesting. So that was sort of the history behind what that is and why we used it. It came off of the cover of one of the early 1930s catalogs to the California Watercolor Society.
I think that was one of the early catalogs that we still have in our archives that you were able to pick up when you came and visited. And
yeah, that's
Austin,
right.
Yeah, Austin, thank you so much for doing that. It is so Art Deco, and it just really fits the times. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous logo.
Yeah. Okay, well, we got a lot to cover, so let me get going right here with this first painting. This is a Marion Wachtel, obviously, you can see there on the front. And Marion Wachtel was really the only founding member that I could find that was a full-time watercolor painter. In other words, that was her primary painting medium. Almost everyone, in fact, I think everyone else in the founding members was primarily an oil painter, or there's 1 or 2 people that worked in drawing and pastel. And they were actually, interestingly enough, some of the early shows included pastels and just slightly colored drawings. So, and they were small shows. There weren't very many members, under 20 members. And that they sort of gradually added more members as it went on a little bit. Now, Marion Wachtel, sometimes you hear that, some of these people were overlooked as artists. Women artists were overlooked, but she was certainly not overlooked. She was actually hailed as the premier watercolorist in Southern California at that time, and she got a lot of attention for that. She also, I'm sorry, we were having a little bit of problem with my screen. Something popped up on my screen that it was kind of unexpected here, so I'm trying to be able to see what I can. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so she was in the reviews in the early days. She was talked about as having selected wonderful views that were really spectacular California views, and that she was able to capture the atmosphere and the special look of California. For me personally, she was my favorite watercolorist of that early period. So she was, for the first section, the 1920s section, 1921 to 1930, she was the featured artist. And so there's 4 works of hers in the exhibition, one of which actually was painted before she married Elmer Wachtel. So it's signed Marion Cavanaugh. And she was exhibiting in San Francisco before she came to Southern California in around 1907. She was exhibiting in the watercolor shows in San Francisco. So she came down here and moved to Pasadena. So the next person that we have here is Gunnar Widforce. He was the second artist that I selected. He was also primarily a watercolor painter. That's why I picked him to talk about today. He was painting more of the arid Southwest, and he was not a founding member, but he was a real early member of the California Watercolor Society. His paintings of the Grand Canyon are really pretty famous, and his ones of this one of Death Valley is a really good example of what he did. He also painted in all of the desert and Southwest areas. In addition to that, if you're ever in Yosemite and you go to the Ahwahnee Hotel, you can see a whole group of his paintings that he painted of Yosemite, and they're just really beautiful. You can't really see it even with the close-up here now. You can't really see. He had this really unique way of manipulating the paint. If you go to the show, get up close to this and take a look at it. He had a painting language that was really very interesting. You can't see it here, but it's actually quite painterly when you get up close, rather than it looking so photographic and rendered. So these two people I chose to represent the 1920s in this talk, or the early 1920s, I should say. Now, in past the 1925, you had a young group of people, and so the people who were founding the society were already well-established professional artists. Like I said, most of them did not use watercolors as their primary painting medium, but they did appreciate it and did put some of their watercolors that they did in gouaches in the show. Carl Oscar Borg was one of the ones that did a lot of really good gouaches. So then, but they were almost all painting landscape subject matter. Then all of a sudden, these young people from Chouinard Art Institute, when I say young, I'm talking about 18 to 24 years old, they began joining the society, and a lot of them joined the society all at one time. And Millard Sheets was probably the first person, and Phil Dyke, and this guy, Hardy Gromacki. They were some of the early of the young group that joined the society in the late 1920s. Well, starting in about 1926. And Hardy Gromacki, this particular artist, was he claimed that he painted 6 watercolors a day for 3 straight years, and they were small, generally a half sheet or less. A lot of them, like this one, was a quarter sheet, which is about 11 by 15. But he painted them. He said that his goal in doing that many paintings was that he wanted to not have to think about painting. He wanted to be able to go on location, look at something, and interpret it spontaneously without having to ever think about his painting. And he developed this painting language. And if you look at this, this is truly a painting. There's hardly any pencil on it at all. He just picked up the brush and started painting, and it was a direct painting. That's why these guys were kind of different at the time, because they were using it. They weren't colorizing a drawing. They weren't doing this in the studio. They were out on location. They were painting from what they were looking at and responding to it. So it really was quite a different thing. And they were doing these industrial scenes and these downtown Los Angeles scenes. So here we have Lee Blair, 1935. And 1935 was a big year for the California Watercolor Society, a big year of change. By 1935, a large number of the people who belonged to the society at that point were now part of the younger group. I mean, people under 30 years old. And every year they'd have a meeting at the and they would have a dinner party. And this was, according to Lee Blair, who was a friend of mine who painted this, they would all kind of gather there, and this was the big art event of the year. And so he they're all sitting there and they had dinner and everything was fine. And they expected Bessie Ella Hazen was the president of the Watercolor Society. And usually a watercolor president was for 2 years. And so everybody was sitting around thinking, okay, they're going to say, we nominate Bessie Ella Hazen for a second term. But instead, Hardy Gromacki stood up and said, I nominate Lee Blair for president. And somebody seconded it. And all of a sudden, Lee Blair was the president of the California Watercolor Society, which was a kind of a big shock to everybody. But when he became president, he really launched into the thing. He created the first traveling show that went out of California. And they were matted shows at that time. They didn't frame the paintings. They were all matted. And it was sent out. Then at the same time while he was president, he worked with the Los Angeles County Museum of Art to create a second show that traveled all over Central America and South America through the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So Lee just took the Watercolor Society into a whole different dimension at that point. And to some degree, a lot of the earlier people actually dropped out at that point, and a lot of more younger people came into the society. So this is, without doubt, Millard Sheets was the key person that brought the attention to the California style of watercolor painting and to the California Watercolor Society. During the around 1935, he was being handled by Dazzle Hatfield, a gallery owner in Los Angeles, who handled original paintings by Van Gogh, Picasso, Gauguin, and all of a sudden, he's hanging in that same gallery Millard Sheets' paintings. So this was a pretty heady thing for an artist in their 20s, or would be for anybody at any age. But anyway, Millard then got national exposure. He was on boards where he was jurying shows with Edward Hopper, Charles Birchfield, and Grant Wood became a close friend of his. He got all of those people to exhibit with the California Watercolor Society. Edward Hopper, like I said, and Birchfield and Grant Wood exhibited with the California Watercolor Society for several years. And Grant Wood came out here and gave lectures on regionalist painting. This particular painting you're looking at, you can see that he was obviously pushing the values really hard, the dark and light values. The reason he was doing that was he was doing shows that included about 50% watercolors and 50% oils. His oil paintings had strong dark and light values, and he wanted the watercolors to have the same authority. So he began painting watercolors with a lot richer, deeper values, and they were being exhibited. And this is one of them. So then the next painting, at the same year, he was hired to come to Hawaii and teach at the Honolulu Academy and at the University of Honolulu. And he began interpreting Hawaii in the way that he did. This is kind of, I thought this was a pretty special painting. It's a kind of in his mural style. And you can see how he takes real care to design the negative shapes as well as the positive shapes. If you look closely at this and you look at the negative shapes around the positive shapes, you'll see, especially like look down in the right-hand corner, those leaves and everything, how they're he's doing a lot of places, he's doing them like 50-50. So the negative shapes are the shadows and the positive shapes, the ground, have interesting shapes. If you look at the negative shapes around those black shadow areas, they're really, those shapes, each one of them, he was designing. He was a designer, a consummate designer. And he was recognized for that all over the United States and ultimately all over the world. But so this is, I featured him for the key artist of the 1930s and 40s. And there's about 4 or 5 paintings of his in the exhibit. including the two that you just looked at. So here's Phil Paradise. And, during this period in the California Watercolor Society and in the general art community of these younger artists, there was a friendly competition between them. And Phil was seemed destined and bound that he was going to get as much of that attention as he could, and like Millard Sheets was. So he began exhibiting all over the United States. He was sending his watercolors and his oils to shows everywhere. And he was focused on regional and American scene subject matter, which was really the main thing that was being exhibited at the museums at that time. And he got a lot of attention during that period. Why don't you, maybe you had something you were commenting about, Ken, about this painting?
I was just going to say, it's not only a gorgeous painting value-wise and shape-wise, but look at the way he rendered this wheel. I mean, how many of us, except for maybe Raphael in the Renaissance, could do a perfect oval like this? I mean, the craftsmanship is just exquisite. That's all I really wanted to say. I mean,
okay.
I'm struck by that.
Great. Well, Phil was one of the early people to join this society and was a mover and a shaker in the society at that time. And he was just about everybody except Marion Wachtel that I've mentioned, and Gunnar Woodforce. Just the younger, these guys were all past presidents, and including Phil Paradise. So the Phil Paradise and those ones bring us into the 40s and the war years. And the society during the war years was, I think one year they missed one because of Pearl Harbor, and then they did two the next year. So that was kind of an interesting thing. They had one at the first of the year and one later in the year. But after the war and it came back, then there was a real change. There was different people, a lot of people came and studied art on the GI Bill. And so there was a whole new group of artists that came in. In this particular case, this is George Post. George joined the society in the 30s at the request of Rex Brandt, who was studying at Berkeley at the time and became friends with George. And George was a modernist early on, and was actually his 40s stuff and into the 50s was generally geometric abstraction. So it's a lot more abstract than this. But I selected this one because it has a lot of his sensibility that was a little bit different. I like the big curve of where he did the coastline. And then you can see how he just used the triangular shape all over this to lead your eye around the painting. And he loved triangles, and he incorporated them in his early ones, and really used them effectively. And I always looked at this one and thought it's really pretty interesting about how he used the triangular shape to move your eye around in this painting.
When you speak about those triangles, I'm also noting all the really beautiful repetitions down here and how they hold this entire composition together. It's just exquisite with this curve. You're exactly right about it.
Yeah, he had this way of trapping these washes with this calligraphy that was really different from everybody else. He was really, I got to know George pretty well and wrote a book on him. And he was, some people respond to his stuff and some don't, but I really like George's work. Okay, so this 50s period was when there became a real shift toward abstraction, not necessarily radical abstraction, but they were looking at subject matter and moving things around, and it wasn't as important to capture the exact scene. It was just that they were using the elements and reconstructing them into a painting. This was one that Ed Reith did when they were building the freeway system in Los Angeles. he was going down there and looking at the construction crew stuff, and he was doing a series of paintings. And he did quite a few paintings like this, where it was had to do with construction and things under construction. And he began exhibiting. Now, Ed is the artist that I featured for the 1950 to 1970s period at the Hilbert Museum, mostly because he was on the front edge of it. He and Alexander Dapodi and Keith Crown and a few other people, Leonard Edmondson, they were introducing more modern styles of painting into the society. And they were there was another woman, Jo Riebert. She was just on her own page. Her and Keith Crown were really doing some really interesting, wild stuff at this time. So
Something I'd like to mention something about Edward Reep. If you go to his website, he's got a really great website, and you will be amazed from, I guess, the 30s onward. This guy never stopped making masterpieces and experimenting. He was not only a master of different textures, but he was also a war artist. And he's actually being honored right now in Italy, his memory for the paintings he did when he was in Italy. And I think that you should all, if you get a chance, go to his website, Edward Reep. His daughter Susan put it together, I believe. And you will be astounded at how many incarnations he has had.
That's really true. You can this next. I have another painting of his right here, showing he was working with Emil Beestrom, who was a kind of a well-known modernist from, I think it was Santa Fe, and he opened a school in Los Angeles and had Ed Reep was the main person at the school. You can see this, they were focused on dynamic symmetry as a formula, compositional formula, and this painting was obviously used that formula to in the composition. And so Ed was doing some of these paintings that had a real modernist look. They had a real futuristic almost look to the way he was designing them and painting them. He really was an interesting artist that evolved as his styles evolved and everything. But this mid-50s period made a big difference in the way the paintings were, other people began painting at the Watercolor Society. And he was a teacher at Chenard, teaching a lot of the people who ended up at the Ferris Gallery and all those places in the next generation. So this is just one that I particularly liked, and I think is a strong painting. One last thing is that he introduced the idea of painting larger paintings in a full sheet. 22 by 30 was just his average size. He painted paintings that were like 30 by 45 watercolors back then in the 50s. And that was not that unusual, and that was not that usual. It was very unusual to paint watercolors that large, bigger than a full sheet. One of the things
I'd like to also add to this is if you yourselves, if you paint outdoors and you're familiar with different perspectives, what a master of perspective. I mean, look at this, this consistency of being able to make it seem like everything is in a bird's eye view. And even this road coming up on this side, I mean, this is just masterful. When you first look at it, you just see the beautiful design and you think it's almost cubistic, but it's actually quite formal as well, with a very strong bird's eye view and a very consistently professional perspective.
Yeah, he discussed a lot of that in his book, Content of Watercolor, which is actually it's a pretty heady type of book, but it really is an interesting book to read.
Definitely well worth researching. You should go to his website. I just can't praise him.
Right. What's interesting is that this guy, Nick Bergante, was a good friend of his, and he wrote about Nick Bergante's work a lot of times. Ed Reep did when he wrote and taught. Nick Bergante was one of the real early modernists in Southern California. He and Stanton McDonald Wright, they founded the Art Students League in Los Angeles, which was primarily focused on presenting modernist styles of painting. This particular painting, Nick said, was a recollection that he had when he was in Los Angeles, living up in the hills, and there was a big fire came, and he became a volunteer fire department, and he went up on the mountain and was fighting this fire to keep it from coming down and getting a studio in his house. So he did this painting that was his recollection of what it felt like to be on the front line of a fire like this. And I thought this painting, I find his work to be really engaging. And he did a lot of black and white paintings, and some black and white paintings that he then colorized like this, which were really quite interesting.
I bet he was influenced by Odell and Redon.
Yeah, okay. So we can go to the next one now if you like. So we're up into the 60s now, and this is a Rex Brandt. And Rex was a really important painter and teacher in the whole movement. He also was a key member and a past president of the California Watercolor Society. He started out painting very regionalist kind of paintings in the genre of like Edward Hopper and stuff. And then when the 40s came along, he began getting a little bit more modern. And by the 50s, he had really developed this interesting modern painting language that was quite different. And he was interpreting the Newport Harbor a lot. This is one of the ones from his terrace. He and Phil Dyke opened a watercolor school in Corona del Mar. And it was one of the key places where people went to study watercolor painting during that period, during the post-World War II period, and all the way up into the 80s. And Phil taught there early on and off and on, and George Post taught there. And even people like Roger Kuntz taught there. And a lot of people taught there. Robert E. Wood came out of there. George James came out of that school. And he was friends with them a lot. So this next painting is by George James. This brings us up into the 70s when the name of the Watercolor Society was going to change, and when the show at the Hilbert Museum sort of trails off, and the one at the National Watercolor Society picks up. Now this painting is, so you have George, who started out as a painting very representationally, transitioned into a modern California kind of style, then into fairly radical abstraction, and then all of a sudden into photorealism. And he was really early at the same kind of period as Robert Bechtel and the people up in Northern California.
Stephen Korn?
Yeah, well, he was mostly he was painting. No, he started painting photorealism from photographs, and the photograph, working from a photograph was really looked down upon by the 30s and 40s guys. The Millard Sheets and those guys. It's like working from photographs was not cool. You painted on location and everything like that. They've gradually warmed up a little bit to it, but George was just said that, he didn't care where the source was. He was interested in creating interesting images. And this painting, he was one of the first people to paint just random kind of still life things like this that I saw anyway. He was just, and different kinds of ideas of views of looking down on it. And he was painting. This is not a photorealist painting. This is just one of his paintings, but he did do photorealism at this time too, and representational. And that it was at this point that the Watercolor Society really started leaning back toward more a representational painting. And so this is kind of where we
One of the
trail
things
off.
before we move on, I just want to note how you can take everyday objects like this and create a rectangular and square dominant composition, and then just do these little accents of circles, little Wonder Bread circles. And I think it's just a fascinating composition. And I think that there's another artist named Manny Farber who also did still lives in a way that was similar, where he took everyday objects. And this is just beautiful, beautiful piece.
So the National Watercolor Society, the name NWS, in the early 70s they transitioned into the National Watercolor Society because it reflected more the people who were in the society. There were a lot of people in the society that were not from California, and they felt that they wanted to expand it out into a larger group of people joining the society, and not thinking that they had to be from California to belong to the society. So it reflected more. So we're going back a little bit because they pick up in 55, but this is an interesting painting by Alexander Dapodi. Dapodi was from San Francisco Bay Area, and during that period in San Francisco, you had Clifford Still and Mark Rothko teaching and promoting non-objective painting, and then you had people like Richard Diebenkorn and Hassel Smith coming out of that, and Alexander Dapodi was also doing similar works at the same time. And he was over teaching at the California College of Arts and Crafts over in Oakland on the edge of Berkeley. And when he gave up his position at the California College of Arts and Crafts, Richard Diebenkorn took it over. And that's when he moved to Berkeley and did the Berkeley series of paintings that really put him on the map in a lot of ways. And so he and Diebenkorn had a friendship, and they were painting in the non-objective. This was an introduction. This was on the cover of the California Watercolor Society 1955 catalog, and it was the purchase prize, and it signaled that non-objective painting was also going to be exhibited in the Watercolor Society. And from that point on, more paintings of that sort began to appear in the shows. This is more typical. This is called Rocks and Snow, and you can see that it was based on some kind of a subject matter, probably rocks and snow. You can't really, I don't know that if it wasn't in the title that you would necessarily identify that, but most of the artists that were in the society still did lean toward abstracting subject matter that was already existing, rather than just doing non-objective painting with that was spontaneous and not having nothing to do with looking at anything or trying to create a abstract based on subject matter that they were viewing. So this is, I think, a very nice example from 1957, and that I selected that for that reason. Also, you can see that it has a lot of opaque color in it, and that was part of the transition that was happening in the 50s, that they were using more opaque colors. And again, you have another abstract, this one by Clinton Adams, who was an important printmaker and also watercolorist. And he too was doing abstraction. This was probably a close-up of some bricks or something, some bricks or wall or something like that. I don't know what it exactly would be, but
looks like marble for sure.
Yeah.
Up in here.
Yeah, and I think what happened is,
oxides.
yeah, this was typical of what they were doing at that time. They were taking a real close detail of some thing, and it would, by doing that, they could create a design, a modern design that was that worked as a modernist piece of art.
What a
And
beautiful limited palette too.
yeah, and he had a really great sense of color. I just like his color values and the way that he did that. So here we have John Quack at 68. He didn't always do hard edge work, but this is typical of the kind of hard edge work that was showing up. Lozier Feidelson had been promoting this for quite some time. He had a TV program where he interviewed artists, and he was teaching at Art Center and other places, and he was really promoting hard edge painting and modernist hard edge non-objective painting. And Carl Benjamin from Claremont and Hammersley and there was quite a few people who were doing hard edge painting, but those were some of them. They had a whole movement there in the 60s and maybe into the early 70s, and since then have influenced a lot of artists to that kind of work.
You know, Gordon, I just wanted to say one thing about that John Quack painting in the gallery, where it has an unbelievably huge presence in the gallery. It really is commanding when you come in and you look at it.
I agree. In fact, I was so excited to see it. I'd never seen it in person. I've reproduced it in at least 2 books. And then I got to see it in person. That was the first time when I went up to the gallery to see this show. I was really excited to see this painting in person. It's a beautiful piece. And he did quite a few geometric abstraction kinds of works that I thought were remarkable, really.
It's actually since you saw it last, the gallery has been slightly rearranged and it's in a really commanding place right now. You just
great.
Go in and it just jumps out at you. Anyway.
Right. So again, I'm talking about representational art coming back. This painting, I think, was featured at one time in the National Watercolor Society catalog and everything. I guess it's won a purchase prize if it was in the show, maybe.
They all do. They're all these paintings were all award winners for purchase.
Yeah, and he was a Laguna painter. Then his wife ran a gallery in Laguna. I remember going and seeing his paintings and thinking, he was really good at what he was doing, this representational painting and doing scene paintings, but bringing them up to date. And it was really quite interesting to see how popular this style of painting was becoming again in the California Watercolor Society, and how many artists were gravitating toward either photorealism or just realism and in watercolor painting. And so that was a real something that really got going back in the 70s and grew more and more. And David Solomon was one of the people that was really on the forefront of bringing in that kind of painting into the California Watercolor or the National Watercolor Society at that time. I wasn't really familiar with this woman, but I read that her husband was a photographer and that she did most of her paintings from his photographs. And so he would take photographs and she would select out certain ones, and then she would do these large paintings. Again, this is another kind of realism, and not exactly photorealism, but taken from a photograph and probably designed and bumped to where she worked it over and created, I think, a very interesting visual image.
Look at the spider.
Yeah, the spider. Really, this painting just fascinated me when I saw it, so that's why I picked it out. I thought it kind of speaks to the diversity of how diverse the shows have been, which I think is really interesting. That the national I've been going to the National Watercolor Society shows off and on for all through the years, and I was kind of I had interviewed so many artists at that time, and then these people were from out of state, a lot of them, and it wasn't going to be easy to interview them. But it has been really enlightening to go over and see this show, to see some of these people and how they manipulated watercolor and how they designed paintings. And this is one that I thought was exceptionally nice.
I like the way the circles, the simply shaped circles, are a good contrast to all the complexity and random shapes.
Yes.
And the fact that the circles are used is almost a way of saying, I'm looking deeply into nature. I'm seeing things like spiders, et cetera. And I think it's just a really great way to emphasize the beauty and variation in nature.
Yeah, I also, it's interesting is that lime green and orange are really two 1970s colors. They're really strong. And I thought that was kind of interesting that it ended up appearing in this painting from the 1970s. So this is, there's people coming in doing what was called hyperrealism, or really strong photorealism. And I guess this woman, I looked up a bunch of her stuff, and she was really doing some interesting work. This was exhibiting, and I think I wanted to put this in there because it typified the kind of photorealism that started in the 70s and continues till today. And this is somewhere in between. I'm not sure of the date of this, but it's more recent than the 70s. I think this is probably the 90s.
It's 98.
Yeah. So I wanted to show how.
There's the voyeur right there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and this style of painting has become engaging to a lot of people. And I wanted to feature some paintings that kind of typified that.
You know, before you go on from that one, what's interesting is the reflection paintings, I think, have come around again as being very popular things for watercolor artists to paint. And it's interesting to see this one was being done back then.
Right. That it was, I agree with that. That's a good point. So this guy I didn't know anything about, went in, and I love this painting. And I've always thought that it would be, I've seen people use liquid masking and frisking and things like that, but I hardly ever saw them use it that creatively. And I started looking at this, and I thought, this is amazing. This person really has developed a way of using masking and using the different kinds of painting techniques to in an effective way. And I thought the way it layers and the way that he's able to get a lot of things happening is really quite interesting. I found the painting. I don't, and again, maybe you know more about, but you two know more about him than I do. I don't know much. I read a little bit about him, but I looked at.
He was a musician, and he kind of came into painting, and he's sort of the archetypal beginner's mind. And he just took his creativity and his sense of music and his daring to be different attitude into watercolor, and he was fearless. They called him the bad boy of watercolor. He was like, unfortunately, he's gone now. Anyway,
I just
this is about 44 by 44 inches, so it's a very large, impressive.
It's a large piece. It's very commanding, and I have to say that I would have driven down there from San Clemente to the National Watercolor Society just to see this one and the John Quack. But I was surprised to see all these other wonderful paintings. It was really a great thing. I really recommend going down and seeing that show. This last one, I brought in another George James for a couple of reasons. One reason is that it shows again how this guy transitioned. He went through so many transitions. It was unbelievable. And I remember him showing me how he was going to be working on Yupo paper, this synthetic paper. And he got all excited about it, was doing these washes and everything. And I think that one thing that's kind of interesting that probably people don't think about, George was 82 when he painted this painting. And he was like at 80 when he completely changed everything he was doing and started working on Yupo and went into a complete different direction in his art, and so and actually won major awards at the American Watercolor Society and Purchase Prize awards. And I mean, it's great to see that this guy at 80 years old was able to just come back in and reinsert himself into the National Watercolor Society and American Watercolor Society shows, and actually win major prizes and be considered right up there on the cutting edge. So that was exciting. I wanted to put this one in and point that out because he really was an innovative guy, and he was, interestingly enough, he was not. I mean, I had to work at it to get this guy to talk about his art. He just didn't talk about his art. He was a teacher at Cal State Fullerton University when I was there, but he taught watercolor painting, and he was a good teacher, but he didn't talk about himself and his art. And it was just real interesting. Eventually, I got to be friends with George and realize what really a special artist he was. He was really a wonderful painter.
So,
And
so before we close and go to questions, can you just make a quick comment about your feeling of, since you curated the show about the California Watercolor Society and now
Right.
got a chance to see the later painters, how do you compare the original California Watercolor Society artists to the painters that you see in the National Watercolor Society exhibitions
Right.
now?
Well, I would say that first of all, the earlier shows, you can look at the catalogs, and I've looked at all. I have a really full collection of the catalogs, and they began having pictures in them, and you began to see what the artists were, and I became familiar with the artists. Now, these artists that I've selected here, these were all great artists that were as good as anybody can get, I think, in for what they were doing. But across the board, the exhibitions, I think today, are probably a higher quality than they've ever been. They're juried in, they're carefully selected. They have a huge number of paintings that they're selecting from. And because of that, they, as the society has grown, I think the shows, actually, the quality of the shows has probably gone up and up and up, in my opinion. So I would say that the shows today actually have more of the higher quality paintings as per, if you're doing it on a ratio, I think they probably do have higher quality paintings than they've had in the past. I think that the society is getting more and more selective on the paintings that are going to the show, and that the shows that I see are really very well curated.
It's reflected also in the fact that we now call it water media, because there's so many options that the original painters didn't really have. I can only imagine what they would have been doing if they had acrylics and they had that it was okay to use opaques. I mean, it's just incredible. But what a history lesson, Gordon.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so one of the questions, Gordon, has to do with the materials that artists are using in regarding pigments and the difference in pigments then in the early years of California Watercolor Society versus the type of pigments we have now.
So, okay, the early, the pigments before World War II, I mean, there was an abrupt, you couldn't get a lot of ink and colors because it came from Germany at one time, and you couldn't get that much during the war. So there are different things of that. But before, in the 30s, there was a man named Mr. Pottinger, and he made paint for these artists, and it was a really basically gum arabic and pigment, and it was really heavy in pigment and no filler at all. And they were used to having watercolor paint that when you were done with your painting session, you had no sludge in the bottom of the water tray. And it was interesting that as they began to limit the amount of pigment that could go into watercolors, it did change. And also the whole way that they make watercolors and everything has changed. So, but that doesn't mean it's better or worse, it's just different. So if you look at those early paintings that are over at the Hilbert Museum, you'll see that they do actually have a different look, especially yeah. You can see that the pigments are different and the colors are different. So they're different. I'm not sure that they're necessarily better or worse, because you do have all the different stuff that is attaching the pigment. I mean, now you have acrylics and you have all different kinds. They didn't have that many options. They had gouache, they had transparent watercolor, and they had casein. And casein had a very matte surface to it, and it looked quite different, but it photographed beautifully. So it was made for illustration. It was made to be photographed, and it had no sheen, and it actually photographed better than transparent in some ways. But then later, when photography got better, transparent watercolors now, I mean, really photograph beautifully.
Uh-huh. The other comment that you had made that was interesting was regarding Yupo and
Yeah.
the introduction of Yupo and George James. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. All that I know about Yupo really came from George, because he was such a promoter of this material. And
it's basically Mylar that architects use.
Yeah. And Yupo was originally made for printing on for posters that were going outdoors. And the reason that it got so popular was because, you print on paper and you put it on a telephone pole, a poster, it's going to be gone in 2 days. It's just ripped up, and if water gets on it, it gets ruined. But you print it on Yupo, and you can put this stuff outdoors outside of windows of stores and everything like that without it deteriorating at all. So it was primarily made as a paper for printing on. But George kind of picked up this, and I'm not sure of how many other artists did at the same time, but George picked up on it and started painting on it. And he was excited about it because he said you could sponge off areas, and it worked really well with sponging water on it. He said you could, if you made a error that you didn't like, you could sponge it out.
So is that last painting, Ken, on Yupo, of George James? You want to go?
Yes, actually it is. And this is the one thing about Yupo, you don't want to use any paintings that have honey as a base, like the Graham paintings, because they just, anytime it gets humid, they reactivate. And a lot of times I roomed with George when I taught at Canuga. He was my roommate, and it was a very fit early 80s at the time. And he sprays a lot of his paintings at the end with Krylon or something like that.
Right.
Just because of that, if it gets humid, they sometimes just reactivate. But this is the traditional Yupo, and he used a lot of rollers and scrapers and.
Right. Yeah, he actually, if anyone has interest in it, I know there are some programs that George did that you can get probably on CD that discuss Yupo painting. in how to use it.
Well, I would really like to thank you, Gordon. What a interesting walk through the
Yeah.
history of watercolor, water media, the Watercolor Society before became national, and then to become national. And it was such a wonderful opportunity that you had curated that exhibition at the Hilbert, and that we have our permanent collection up right now, and that people would be able to see them back to back. Orange isn't too far from San Pedro, and so it's a nice opportunity to see these older ones and then these newer ones.
If you go to the Hilbert Museum, there's a Ruby's restaurant right there. And one of the things I want to mention about Gordon, just real quickly, is if you go in there, you will see a lot of orange crate paintings. You remember those beautiful orange labels. Gordon is one of the primary authorities on the orange crates from Orange, California. And you can eat lunch there, and you can see illustrations of the Santa Fe Railroad, all these California type illustrations. And then you can drive over to San Pedro and go to the National Watercolor Society and see the continuation of what the California Art Club started. I mean, California Watercolor Society started.
Yeah. So thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Ken, for that interesting history. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Please visit the National Watercolor Society website for all of our upcoming activities. And it has been a pleasure to host this conversation today. You have so much information, Gordon. We may have to do a part 2. Thank you all for attending today, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.